Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the sixth week of our Recovery Leadership Institute's Summer Series. My name is Clarice Redding Lewis, Chief Recovery Community Officer at Hanley Foundation, where our mission is to eliminate addiction through prevention, recovery, and advocacy support. Tonight, we will be discussing civil commitment issues and substance use disorder with Marchman Act and family law attorney Joe Considine. Just as a reminder, tonight's presentation as well as next week's will be virtual only. This is our effort to keep you and your family members safe. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to drop your questions into the chat for tonight's moderated Q&A that will be immediately following the presentation. And be sure to complete our brief survey at the end for a chance to win a $25 Amazon gift card. Also, we'd like to take this time to thank our partners and sponsors for this evening, the Palm Beach County Hub, Palm Beach County Community Services Department, and all of our supporters. Tonight, we have the pleasure of meeting with Mr. Joe Considine. And just to give you a brief background, Joe has practiced law in South Florida since 1983. He is also a lifelong resident of Florida. His practice is limited to addiction-related law, including the Marchman Act and family law. Joe has handled over 1,500 litigation cases in his career, appearing in courts throughout Florida. Joe works extensively with families whose loved ones have substance abuse and mental health issues. He is committed to educating the public about the need for treatment and substance use disorders, including through the use of court orders. He is the author of many articles and lectures throughout Florida on the Marchman Act and other substance abuse-related issues. Joe is recognized as an authority on Florida's Marchman Act. These articles are easily accessible on Joe's website, joeconsidinelaw.com. Joe has been a member of the board of directors of the Fern House in West Palm Beach, a residential rehabilitation facility for indigent men with substance use disorders, for over 25 years. Joe also enjoys assisting and participating with the Max Planck Institute for Neuroscience in Jupiter, Florida, as a member of the Brain Trust. We are so fortunate to have him here to share his expertise this evening. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joe Considine. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Clarice. Thank you. Thank you for having me this evening. And I again want to thank the Hanley Foundation in Palm Beach County, John Hullick, and the Hub for sponsoring this very important community resource, this Recovery Leadership Institute, which is designed to help average Palm Beach Countyans learn about the scourge that is substance use disorder and co-occurring mental health disorders, and that there's recovery possible in this. And so that we can all become ambassadors, we can all learn something, and so we can help our family and our neighbors. And so tonight, my job is to talk about substance use disorders and co-occurring mental health disorders, and using the courts to help people get into treatment, to help families get their loved ones into treatment. And so what we're going to cover tonight, the following items. We're going to talk about the scope of the problem, and it is a significant problem. Others in this lecture series have talked about it as well. We're going to talk about what happens to the brain on substances, so you'll get a better idea of what's happening to your loved one or to neighbors and friends when they're in the midst of a substance use disorder. We're going to talk about treatment and recovery. We're going to talk about how to get people into treatment and recovery using involuntary commitment. And we're going to talk about why do we use the Marchman Act. We're going to talk about the process so that when you leave here tonight, you're going to have some idea of how the Marchman Act works. We're going to talk about a couple of pitfalls, and then lastly, a way forward. So the thrust of the evening is getting the substance impaired the help that they need using Florida's Marchman Act, named after Hal S. Marchman, passed in 1993, really a leading law throughout the country. People come to Florida because we have this law here from all over the country, and why other states don't have it, I don't understand. It's called the Florida Substance Abuse Impairment Act. So let's talk about the problem. What kind of problem are we talking about? So I did not know this until I was researching this, that since the 1990s, when the drug pandemic began, we've lost more than 900,000 Americans to drugs. That's an incredible number. That's probably double of what the number is with COVID-19. Just during the last year, in 2020, during the pandemic, we lost 93,000 Americans from overdose on drugs. We lost 95,000 people due to alcohol-related deaths. These numbers come from the National Center for Health Statistics, the National Institute of Health. The other numbers that I'm going to talk about come from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Agency, which is a federal agency. And these are good. Go to their websites and look at these numbers. They're amazing. Not only do we have we have 23 million Americans that have substance use disorders. And part of what attracted me to this lecture series was the effort to stop talking about addiction and alcoholism and to talk about substance use disorders. That's what the kind of the Bible for people in treatment and mental health professionals. They use the DSM-5, and they talk about substance use disorders as opposed to addiction and alcoholism. So we know that 23 million Americans have a substance use disorder. 43 million Americans have some form of mental illness. 8 million have a substance use disorder and a co-occurring mental health disorder. And we have about 14.5 million adults have significant alcohol impairment, an alcohol use disorder, but only 8% have received treatment. There's so much work to be done to help these people. Continuing on, among mental health issues, anxiety disorder is the most reported, and depressive disorder is next. We're seeing psychosis showing up. All I do is Marchman Act work. I filed 3 cases in the last week, including one today, involving young men who are vaping THC, THC being the active ingredient in cannabis that gets you high, that gets people high. That's so much stronger now than back when I was in college, and is a psychoactive substance now. But what we're seeing is that these young people whose prefrontal cortex, whose brain haven't developed yet, because they're frequently using cannabis and THC, there's psychotic features are being seen. High agitation, delusional thinking, paranoid thinking, and that's because the THC levels are dangerously high. So let's talk about what substances do to the brain. So we know that substance use disorder is a chronic disease that changes the brain structure and changes the function of the brain. It changes the way that various parts of the brain talk to the other parts of the brain. In my association with the Max Planck Institute for Neuroscience in Jupiter, which is a great, we're so fortunate in Palm Beach County to have this entity there. Our chief research scientist for neuron disorders, when I told her what I did with the Marchman Act, she said, "Oh, substance use disorder is a severe neuronal disorder." And that kind of stopped me for a minute, because it made it very clear that this is a neurological issue that we're dealing with. It's not an issue of morality or good person or bad person. We're talking about somebody whose neurological position in their brain has been radically altered by the frequent use of substances. So let's talk, what happens? So at a basic level, we all have this pleasure signature. Whether the pleasures register in the brain for all of us the same way. So whether we're looking at a beautiful baby or a sunset, or we've done well in school, or we've done well on the job and we've got a promotion, or we have a nice glass of wine or a sexual encounter, all of these pleasures register the same way in the brain. And that's through the various neurotransmitters in the brain's pleasure center. So, and mainly what I'm going to talk about, because I didn't do well in science, that's probably why I went to law school, but I understand a little bit of this, and I want to thank Dr. John Dybin for helping me better understand this. But these events, the The pleasurable events, seeing a baby, holding your lover's hand, getting a raise at work, they trigger a release of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. I'm only going to say that once, ventral tegmental area. I'll refer from now on to VTA. Remember what that means. It's a tongue twister. And the nucleus accumbens and those in the VTA are both in the mesolimbic part of the brain. They're in the middle part of the brain. And so we're going to now see this good-looking guy talk about something. One of the things that I tell a family when they're trying to make a decision about this is what happens neurologically in a substance abuser's brain. There's really a process that takes place that no amount of cajoling and begging and pleading can interfere with from the family. And here's the process that takes place. We call it a hijacked brain. So we all have a pleasure signature where we see something that's pleasant, we have a nice meal, a loved one gives us a kiss, we've done well in a job. And that registers in the mesolimbic part of the brain where the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area reside as dopamine flooding that area, and then signals going from that mesolimbic area to our prefrontal lobes that are the executive decision-making part of our brain. When a person becomes addicted to substances or an alcoholic has a substance use impairment, what has happened is that the nucleus accumbens, the dopamine receptors in that area are so demanding of more and more substances because the dopamine that's produced in those substances in that area of the brain. And so what happens is that the brain goes from liking something, liking a drink, to absolutely having to have it in order to be okay. And there's an adjustment that's going on in the neural pathways between the mesolimbic area of the brain and the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And so when I explain this to families, it's easier for them to see that their loved one needs help because their brain has been hijacked. It's not about them being good people or bad people or the parents being good or bad. It's about that their loved one's brain has been altered in this neurological fashion by the substances they've been abusing. Okay. So this summarizes what just said on the video, that the brain circuits are important for natural rewards such as food, music, sex. The brain reward comes in the form of dopamine and other neurotransmitters as well. This gives you a little bit of idea of what a part of the brain, the neuron, looks like, where on the left side of the slide, you'll see where when somebody's eating food and there's some dopamine in there, there's dopamine transporters, there's dopamine receptors, and there's a few in that particular area. Put cocaine into the picture, and on the right-hand side, you see a massive proliferation of dopamine and dopamine receptors. And the dopamine increases are exaggerated in the communication between that part of the brain where the dopamine resides in the mesolimbic part of the brain, and the communication with the prefrontal part of the brain, which is our executive decision-making part of the brain, is radically altered after prolonged use. So, in effect, what happens is that these substances hijack the brain. Repeated exposure to substances or behavior changes the way nerve cells in the nucleus accumbens and the VTA communicate with the prefrontal cortex. And so what happens is that the person with the substance use disorder forgoes eating and sleeping, all the natural things that we're supposed to do, parenting, showing up at work, paying bills, to satisfy their perceived need. And that's also why, in a way, that no amount of begging, cajoling, pleading with a loved one whose brain has been hijacked works. Sometimes it may work, but I mean, generally when it doesn't work, it doesn't, because the pathway between the mesolimbic area of the brain and the prefrontal cortex, which makes decisions for us, has been hijacked. And so now what happens is that the prefrontal part of the brain goes to protect the part of the brain that wants more dopamine. And so that's where denial comes from, that's where minimizing comes from, that's when, no, I'll stop tomorrow, when your loved one says that, that's what's going on in the brain. So what do you tell a family member, a neighbor, a client, if you're a person in the treatment field? What do you tell them about this when they've presented this terrible scenario to you that, you know, this person just won't stop no matter what, and they won't go to work, and they won't parent their children, and they won't pay their bills? You tell them that they're dealing with a hijacked brain, that they're dealing with a severe neurologic disorder that needs to be treated. And, you know, I kind of grew up in the Al-Anon and other recovery areas where they basically used to say, and they're very well-intentioned people said, we've got to let the addict hit bottom. Well, here's the problem with that. We've lost 93,000 people from drugs last year, 95,000 from alcohol-related deaths last year, year after year. As many people die in 1 year from drugs, just drugs, as died in the entire Vietnam War. Those are amazing numbers. So can we afford to let people wait till they hit bottom? You know, and I would say that the science says that we don't have to wait, nor can we afford to wait. So what do? Well, the evidence in a lot of research indicates that the highest success rates that are like the commercial airline pilots program for one, impaired doctors, impaired nurses for 2 other programs, that the highest success rates come from a combination of long-term treatment with internal and external motivating factors. New York Times columnist David Brooks, about 2 or 3 years ago, wrote a column that said that the opioid epidemic was so severe that we needed a form of benign paternalism to deal with it. In benign paternalism, and this guy is kind of a moderate, he's not a liberal, he's not a conservative, he's right in the middle, but basically was saying that we as a society need to do something. We need to be proactive with this and not wait for people to die, wait for people to hit bottom. And the Marchman Act is a form of benign paternalism. So when I first started practicing in this area, taking over for my beloved senior partner, who's since gone on, Jim Robinson, I came up in that Al-Anon milieu where, you know, you just kind of step over the body and you don't enable, and you pray that they recover. So I had to do some research, and I looked, and there's a number of studies out there that all conclude similarly that involuntary commitment to treatment is at least as effective, if not more so, than voluntary treatment. That was a game changer for me. I looked for more studies. There's something wrong with that study. Study after study that I read, including from UCLA, the National Institute of Mental Health, later studies published in the American Journal of Addictions of some of the top psychiatrists from the top schools and hospitals in the country. In the name of the article is Use of Coercion in Addiction Treatment. Same thing. So that leads us to the need to legally intervene upon a loved one whose life is just in the dumps because of their substance use disorder. So why do licensed professionals, pilots, doctors, nurses, licensed mental health counselors, lawyers, do better in treatment than the general population? Why is that? Again, we've talked about this. The impaired airline pilots have the highest rate of success, 90%. That's amazing. And there's something you might want to look at this. The Human Intervention Motivation Study, HIMSS, is the program through the FAA requiring long-term treatment and monitoring. One of the reasons is the leverage of keeping the job, of creating skin in the game. A friend of mine mentions this. We create skin in the game to help these people change what's going on in their brain. So for people who don't have a license, whose license is at risk, like if a lawyer or a clinician or a pilot, they run the risk of losing their license if they don't get if they don't get sober and stay sober. So how do we do that for the average people out there who don't have professional licenses? How do we create skin in the game for them? Well, the Marchman Act does that. And it does it by the entry of a court order that a family can get, first requiring an assessment and stabilization, and then a second order for treatment. The violation of that order subjects the individual to contempt and possible incarceration, hence skin in the game. Now they've really got something at risk here. And most people don't want to deal with jails. So the way that let me talk for a minute about that, because families are always worried. You know, will my child, my loved one, go to jail if they fail? And the answer is that is a leverage piece that can be used. In the hundreds of cases, I think about 600 cases, we've had 3 people go to jail because they would die if they didn't. They had run from treatment. And each one of them, when they came back, jail, we call it jail therapy. They said, don't want to go back there, I'll go to treatment. This is not designed as punishment. The idea of contempt and impossible incarceration are designed to compel compliance with the court order. So once the person says, I give up, I'll go back to treatment, they have the keys to their jail cell. They get to go back to treatment. And so, again, I want to reiterate this. This is not a punishment. It's not a crime. This is a civil statute. The purpose of contempt and incarceration is to require compliance with the court order. And again, once the person says, I'll go back to treatment, I'll follow the court order, they're released from jail. So let's talk about treatment and recovery, and let's talk about some principles of treatment. This is from a Principles of Drug Addiction Treatment, which is a research-based guide from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And there's 3 objectives that I highlighted from there that are met by the Marchman Act. The first is that remaining in treatment for an adequate period of time is critical for treatment effectiveness. Secondly, substance use disordered individuals with coexisting mental disorders should have both disorders treated in an integrated way. That was one of the things that Marcia talked about last week with co-occurring disorders. And then thirdly, recovery from substance use disorders can be a long-term process. It usually is a long-term process because we're talking about that neural readaptation that has to take place. And that doesn't take place in 30 days. It takes a couple of years for that to take place. And it frequently requires multiple episodes of treatment. So one of the things that I like too that we talked about in some of our pre-production meetings with the Recovery Leadership Institute was William White's work. That we don't shame people who have their symptoms reoccur because we know that happens. And we want them to get back in and take care of that. So these objectives are met by the Marchman Act. First of all, remaining in treatment for an adequate period of time. Let me see if I'm good. So we can, under the Marchman Act, I've been able to keep people in treatment for up to 12 months. A lot of times it's 90 days, it's 6 months, but it gives them a head start on this. But the Marchman Act works in a way that you can keep people in treatment for a long period of time, number one. I want to go back to, so number 2, the Marchman Act provides specifically for treatment of coexisting mental health disorders. So it was written in a way, it was written by some smart folks who understood that if you're dealing with substance use disorders, you're usually dealing with some coexisting mental health disorder as well. There's usually some type of underlying depression, anxiety, bipolar issues that are going on that the person is self-medicating with. And then lastly, that it's a long-term process and frequently requires multiple episodes of treatment. There's no limit to the number of times you file a Marchman Act. There's no limit to it. As long as the person meets the criteria for the Marchman Act, which I'll get into, a Marchman Act can be filed, and a Marchman Act can be renewed. A treatment order can be renewed a number of times, as long as the person continues to meet the criteria. We know that treatment works and more treatment works better, and hopefully we'll start to engage more in terms of getting our state to adequately fund treatment for people who don't have resources, who don't have insurance, and who don't come from wealth, who can afford to go to treatment. You know, our community was hurt badly with the closure of CARP, in the detox unit, and with the closure of Wayside House for Women. And we do have Drug Abuse Foundation right now that can help people who don't have any resources, but they're underfunded and they need help. So why do we use the Marchman Act? Because we know that court-ordered treatment is effective. We've gone through that. Here's another, the study done by Anglin and Prendergast at UCLA Drug Abuse Research Center. And one of the things, we call it the nudge from the judge. You know, look, the judge says, we want you to go get help, we want you to get treatment, and I'm going to enter a court order that says you have to do this, and there'll be consequences if you don't follow it. That's what every single one of our hearing officers talks about to them. We're here to help you. We want to make sure you do this. Your family is so concerned that this is what they filed this pleading, and now I, as the Marchman Act hearing officer, am telling you that we're going to enter a treatment order, and there will be consequences if you violate that. So please don't do that. We call it the nudge from the judge. We know that legal pressure can increase treatment attendance and improve retention. In that individuals who are under legal pressure tend to have better outcomes than those without legal pressure. And we're seeing more and more now. When I first started doing these talks probably about 10 years ago, I was concerned because even the treatment industry didn't have a working familiarity with the Marchman Act. But as me and more of my colleagues talk about this, we're seeing that residential and outpatient programs are recommending the use of the Marchman Act to get people who need treatment into treatment, and it keeps people in treatment who want to leave. So the Marchman Act can also not only get somebody into treatment, if somebody's in treatment and they want to leave before it's recommended that they leave, the Marchman Act applies, and you can get an order requiring them to stay in treatment and continue and complete treatment. We talked about this objective about addressing both the substance use disorder and the co-occurring mental health disorder. I've been able to use it for primary psychiatric issues which could not be addressed by the Baker Act. The Baker Act is a good tool, but it deals with really extreme situations, immediate harm to the person, whereas a person who's manic and bipolar and is not exactly, doesn't qualify for the Baker Act, but if they're using some substance, the Marchman Act can help them. Because there's usually some level of self-medicating that's taking place with people who have a psychiatric disorder. And I ask families when they come in, they say, well, there's no obvious substance use, but our loved one is manic or psychotic and having all these issues. And I said, please go back and look, because there's probably some self-medicating that's taking place, and usually there is. And I combine the two, their behavior, their outlandish behavior, with the levels of self-medicating, and can frequently get treatment orders for them. So sometimes the Marchman Act can act as the gap for cases that the Baker Act doesn't cover. So here's an important piece for families. The Marchman Act is a confidential process. It's by law, it's confidential. No one other than the parties can know about the filing. There's no disclosure of court records to third parties. It's against the law to do that. And no one can even find out that, so I filed 3 cases in the last week. And if somebody, a future employer, a university comes into Palm Beach County and goes onto the clerk's website to try to see what this person has been involved in, whether criminal or whatever, they'll never see that the person had a mental health or Marchman Act case filed against them. And that's an important thing. We don't want people knowing about this. There's no residency requirement for the Marchman Act of either the family who's filing or the person who needs help. We've had people come in from out of state, and as long as they're located in the state of Florida, they're subject to the Marchman Act. And that's why we have interventionists and case case managers in treatment facilities encourage families to bring their person with a substance use disorder to Florida, so that, because we have this great law. Neither party needs to be a resident of Florida. So what's the procedure? Well, we can get an order for assessment. There's two phases. The first phase is that we seek an ex parte order for involuntary assessment and stabilization. Ex parte means without a hearing. So the law allows that in certain cases where the person is damaging themselves, they're driving drunk, they're driving under the influence, they've fallen and repeatedly hurt themselves, they're threatening neighbors, they're threatening their spouses, that we can get an order can be obtained within 24 hours of filing an emergency petition. The proper drafting of that emergency petition is critical. Law enforcement will pick the person up and take them to the facility that the family has designated. The family has to do the legwork ahead of time to find the facility that either their insurance covers or that if they're self-pay, or to deal with a drug abuse foundation. Once an assessment order is entered, the assessment is done by the mental health clinician who's a qualified professional, and that assessment then is sent to the court. The assessment has to be reviewed by a physician who signs off on it. The assessment has to occur within 72 hours of admission, and the assessment has to be transmitted to the court without delay. This is very important. We can't get a treatment hearing, which is phase 2, until the assessment has been transmitted to the court. I think this is a repeat. So in the assessment standards for the involuntary treatment, the providers who make the assessments, they have to come into court to testify, and they've got to talk about the protocol to be utilized in treatment. The form and the content of the report has to be made clear in the assessment as well. So now when we're talking about the treatment, the involuntary treatment criteria, one of the criteria is that without services, the person is likely to suffer substantial harm, and that there's a substantial likelihood that without services, the respondent, that's the individual with the substance use disorder, will suffer serious bodily harm as evidenced by recent behavior. We're missing a slide here. So the criteria are these, and for some reason this didn't show up. The first one is that there has to be a substance use impairment. That means that they've lost the use of self-control with respect to substances, and it's affecting them in a serious way. The second one is that because of that substance use impairment, the individual doesn't appreciate his or her need for services. And that without a court order, the person won't engage in treatment. And then lastly, that without services, they're likely to suffer from neglect or refusal to care for themselves. So when we're going in on the involuntary services part, we have to have a hearing on that part. So remember, the first part is the assessment. We don't have to have a hearing on that. If it's properly presented, the court can enter an order without having a hearing. That's for assessment and stabilization. Now, for the involuntary services, the treatment part, there has to be a hearing. The clinician and the family will testify both as to the contents of the assessment and what the person's been doing. They'll admit that they need help, or the family finds weed in the person's personal belongings, or they see evidence, they see drug paraphernalia, and they come into court and they testify about that. And the petitioner, who's the family, they've got the burden of proving by clear and convincing evidence that all criteria for voluntary admission is met, and that's a high evidentiary burden. Well, look, we're going to take away somebody's rights for up to 90 days. We want to make sure that we're right on this. We don't want people abusing this. And so built into the statute are these due process protections that I, as an attorney, I'm glad that they're there. But I'll tell you what, that by the time the case gets to me, the due process requirements are no problem whatsoever. So what are the due process requirements? Number one, that people get notice, that they receive the copy of the pleadings that are filed. Number two, that if the person can't afford an attorney, The court will appoint one to represent them. And number three, that there's going to be a hearing and they're going to have an opportunity to defend themselves. And we live in a society where that's important. And I say, let's put together the evidence that we need to put together to present a valid and a compelling case to the court. And we use, in all of these cases, I think we've been successful in all of these cases. So what's the purpose? What do we want? What's the outcome that we want? Well, we want an order for involuntary treatment by a licensed service provider for up to 90 days initially. We can get that extended when the criteria still exist, i.e. the criteria being that the person has lost the use of self-control, they have a substance abuse impairment. It's rarely ever that impairment is resolved after 30, 60, 90 days of treatment, and that because of that impairment, they continue to lack the insight to know that they need help, and that if they don't get the continued services, they're likely to suffer from self-neglect or refusal to care for themselves. So we can file a petition to renew the involuntary treatment order. We've got to do that at least 10 days before the end of the 90-day period. And we can get further extensions. Like I said, I've had somebody in treatment for up to a year under a Marchman Act. Mental health professionals testify. Many of my friends who are mental health professionals, they say, Joe, you're the lawyer, you go to court. We don't do that. We help people in our office and in our facility. And I help them understand what's expected of them. I prepare a testimony outline for them so that they understand the questions that I'm going to ask of them. And really what they're testifying about is solely whether the individual meets the Marchman Act criteria and what the recommendation for services are. And I remind the mental health professional that you're the person who got a 4-year undergraduate degree. You spent a year or 2 years to get a master's degree. You've done thousands of hours of interning, and you're the person who knows this individual better than anyone else in terms of what they need. And they use something called the ASAM criteria. The American Society of Addiction Medicine has created 6 dimensions that helps treatment professionals figure out what level of care they need to have. HIPAA, the court order allows the person to testify. It's an exception to non-disclosure. So here we are. We've looked at the numbers. We've seen that, can we really, and we've asked the question, can we wait for people to hit bottom? Can we afford to continue to do that? With 93,000 dead in 2020, from drugs, 95,000 dead from alcohol in 2019. We understand what's going on neurologically. We understand that people with substance use disorders, their prefrontal cortices, the executive decision-making part of the brain, it's not working. Or it's working to protect the ability to continue to get substances because those dopamine receptors in the VTA, the mesolimbic part of the brain, are demanding more. Or they're getting sick without having their drugs. So, and then finally we know that the science, and this is given, we call it black letter law in law, and I want to mention this to a friend of mine who's a wonderful addiction specialist, an internist, a doctor, has such a great heart. She came up to me after one of my presentations 5 years ago and said, Joe, that was nice, but this doesn't really work, does it? And I said, Karen, if I supply you with these studies, you're a scientist, will you review them? Yes. She got back to me about 2 weeks later and said, I didn't know. I did not know. And so she uses the Marchman Act. It's in her quiver. It's an arrow in her quiver to help the families that come to her as well. So we know that involuntary treatment is at least as effective, if not more so, than voluntary treatment. So we know that the Marchman Act, in conclusion, is an effective tool to get people with substance use disorders the help that they need to recover. And with that, I'm open for any of your questions. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Considine, just for giving
Joe.
us your time. Thank you so much, Joe, just for giving us your time. And so we have several questions from the chat. We will do our best to get through all of them. I hope you're ready.
Let's go.
We have some loaded questions.
Let's rock and roll.
Okay. So first question, what is your experience with treatment in jail? How do you feel about it?
How do I feel about treatment in jail? Well, I know a good friend of mine is former Chief Deputy Mike Gauger. He sits on the board with me at, he may be on your board, I don't know. But he sits on the board, he and I have been sitting on the board at Fern House for a long time. And he says the largest mental health unit in Palm Beach County is the Palm Beach County Jail. That's astounding. Those are some severe numbers. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about that. And so when I don't know something, I can't. Other than the fact that, as Chief Gauger says, that the Palm Beach County Jail is the largest mental health unit in Palm Beach County.
Wow.
I know.
That is interesting.
It's sad, to be honest with you. It's sad.
Okay, so we do have another question. How is the cost of treatment determined and who is required to pay, assuming that their financial status is not great?
That's where, and you and I were talking about this beforehand, that's where we need the legislature to get involved. We need the county commission to get involved. We need help. We need money for this. With the closure of the CARP detox unit, and I understand the CARP is reopened now as a residential place, but there's no detox. In the closure of Wayside House for Women, I mean, we're left with the Drug Abuse Foundation, DAF. And DAF does a good job, but they're overworked and underpaid, and it's hard to get people a bed in there. So we really need, my plea to you listening is to contact your state legislators. Pay attention to what's happening with the Hanley Foundation to see, what we can do to put pressure, political pressure, to get the budget increase so we can have the beds that we need for treatment. Because you saw the numbers.
Right.
And this is not going away. I mean, thankfully, the Hanley Foundation is doing great work, and you guys have, because of your efforts, you've increased the start date that people start using substances significantly. But these numbers they're tidal wave type numbers. Another question, please.
Okay. So our next question is, can someone who commits other crimes such as burglary or theft, do they get to avoid jail and criminal records for those crimes if they are found to be under the Marchman Act?
No.
So it only
can
covers...
help them.
Okay.
It can help them if they were under the influence, if they were impaired when they were committing the crime. One of the things, because, as I understand, I don't know criminal law, but as I understand from my colleagues who do criminal defense work and from judges that I know, we don't need more people with substance use disorders in our jail. We need them to get help. That's what we need for them. And so a lot of times the best thing that a person can do who's facing criminal charges is to get their butts into treatment one way or another and to plead with the court through their public defender or whomever that, I did this when my brain was addled, when my brain was hijacked. I'm taking steps. And like I say, we are spending so much tax dollars putting these people in jail when they need real help.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Our next question, do you think long-term inpatient treatment, say 9 to 12 months, is better than these 30 and 90-day programs?
I think the work of my friend Dr. Michael Weiner and others with kind of life management and what's going on at the hub as well. This young man who works here at the hub was just explaining to me the work that's going on here. So, no, there's no, first of all, long-term residential, that rarely happens. But what happens, and I'm going to segue into, so what happens is that residential treatment usually lasts for maybe 60 days, rarely 90 days, but it's usually 45, 60 days. And then there's a step down to something called PHP, partial hospitalization, which is day-night treatment. And that can go on for 60 days or so. Then there's a step down to something called IOP, intensive outpatient, which is, when you combine that with sober living, intensive outpatient, where PHP is, I think, 5 days a week for 5 or 6 or 7 hours a day, living in a structured housing unit. IOP is, I think it's 3 or 4 days a week for 3 or 4 hours a day. And ideally, the person's living in a sober men's house for a man, woman's house for a woman, so that they can slowly start to move out of a protective environment, continue to receive treatment services, but now start to re-enter the job market. And now we're, with those three, what we just said, residential, PHP, and IOP, you're talking about 6 months or so of treatment. But they're being monitored, they're being assisted, and they have a chance now to move on with their lives.
That actually feeds directly into our next question. Should people go to a halfway house after inpatient treatment?
Yes. Next question. Well, I'll tell you why. Because, number one, it's difficult for people to return to the milieu in which they were using. You know, and that's where triggers happen, and you know, that's where they're subject to all kinds of things. So it's better for the person to be in an environment where they're getting support for their recovery. That happens in a sober residence.
Okay, awesome. And so that kind of also leads into our next question. How long would you suggest someone be in inpatient treatment before moving to that sober residence? What is your professional opinion on that?
So I'm not a doctor, even though I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night. Is that how that goes? So I defer to my friends in treatment. What I'm seeing with their assessments is that their recommendations are it depends on what the issues are. Are we talking about the mental health disorders? Are we talking about long-term opiate use? Are we talking about, you know, maybe just only alcohol? And I don't mean only alcohol. So it depends upon so many different things that are set forth in something called the American Society of Addiction Medicine. The acronym is ASAM, the ASAM criteria that guides these great professionals that we have here in determining length and type of treatment. So I defer to them.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question. If the brain has been hijacked, why is it that recovery centers and treatment centers are basically open and individuals can come and go as they please?
Well, Baker Act receiving facilities are not open. They're not, they're locked. Marchman Act receiving facilities, which is a licensed service provider that is qualified to handle substance use disorders, I don't know of any that are locked. What the court order does, and so I don't know why they don't do that, other than the fact that that would be very difficult for them to do. The court order provides for leverage, so that if they do leave, and some people leave and they take off. A woman, this facility she was from Germany. She had a passport. The facility had her passport, her cell phone. She hitchhiked down to the consulate in Miami, was able to get a substitute or a replacement passport, and took off to Germany. Well, you know, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with treatment centers that, you know, are not locked doors. They're not locked facilities. With the Marchman Act, there is an order. The person realizes, in the treatment centers that I work with, where I've presented to them, they do a good job of telling the person, you know, look, using motivational interview techniques. Marcia was, you like how I did that?
I do.
Thank you. Marcia did a nice job last week talking about motivational interviewing techniques. So that's defense number one. And then ultimately the defense number 2 or 3 or 4 is saying to the person, look, your family loves you. They got a court order here. Mm-hmm. If you leave, we have to let the court know. Then there will be consequences that flow from that. And I will tell you that in the overwhelming majority of our cases, that works. That acts, you know, the doors aren't locked, but in essence, they are.
Okay, awesome. That was very helpful information. So our next question, what do we do when the system wants you to wait because they cannot prove that an individual was drug impaired?
What do we, say that again, please, read the question.
So this is how it's written. I'm going to assume that they're talking about in the instance that someone commits a crime while under the influence. What do you do when maybe the court system wants you to wait before you can file a Marchman Act because you cannot prove right away that the individual was drug impaired?
Well, so we're a nation of laws. We have the rule of law. We've got to, this is no different. This is a court case. We've got to be able to present evidence of the person's impairment, or we'll get kicked out of court. So that answers that. And there's all sorts of proofs to that. One is, the best one comes from the person's mouth themselves. A lot of times people will say the next day, they go, oh my gosh, I have to stop this. I stayed out all night, I almost got into a wreck, or they get a DUI, that's great evidence. So the words out of their mouth is that, I gotta stop. But then by 5 o'clock, those words are forgotten because the brain, it's taken over. The dopaminergic pathways.
I'm going to use that word
this
week. I'm going to speak it into
They're demanding
something.
satisfaction. And so many people in the morning will say, I'll go to treatment. And then by the evening, they're like, nah, tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow.
For sure.
So other proof is seeing needles, seeing joints, seeing pipes, seeing dabbing materials, seeing THC oil. And then there's circumstantial evidence that they've lost a lot of weight. They've got sores on their body. They're falling and injuring themselves a lot. We have a questionnaire that we send out to families to help them come up with, to understand what happens to somebody, even though they're not seeing the odor of alcohol on their breath, the glassy eyes, the slurred speech. This is all evidence.
Well, thank you for that. I hope that was helpful to whoever posed that question. Now, our next question, what is the line between recreational use and being drug impaired, and how do we prove it?
Well, when the use of a substance materially and significantly interferes with a person's ability to live their life, that's when they've crossed that line. When the person has lost self-control with respect to using substances, they are then impaired.
Interesting. Okay.
That's the definition in the statute.
Thank you for that. Now, our next question, this is kind of a loaded question.
Okay.
Is there a rule for advance directives to encourage compliance? I've seen studies that showed half of the need for emergency treatment for those with mental health issues, and the other half is for treatment for drug addiction.
Okay, I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Okay. So I'll read it again. Okay. Is there a rule for advance directives to encourage compliance?
I don't know. I don't deal with advance directives. My estate planning people would deal with that. I don't deal with that.
And can you let us know, for those who are unsure, what is an advance directive?
I'm not even sure what an advance. I think it is like don't resuscitate. I think that's what it is. But there's also something called a medical power of attorney that grants to a loved one the ability to make decisions. A lot of times what we deal with are guardianships. When somebody is so impaired by substances and co-occurring mental health disorders, I call in colleagues who do guardianship law, and they create guardianships for these people because they've lost capacity.
That is interesting. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, actually, well, that was our last question from the chat. So thank you everyone for just participating and asking those questions. And thank you for your expertise, Joe. We really appreciate it. I learned a whole lot.
Good. I'm glad.
I'm sure everyone else did as well.
Thank you to the Hanley Foundation, Recovery Leadership Institute. I think it's just such a great idea to create ambassadors in our community. Really well done, you guys. Well done.
Well, thank you
for letting me be a part of it.
And thank you for joining us.
Yes. Okay, good.
And for everyone else who has participated with us this evening, thank you so much. Please be mindful that this was part 6 of our 7-week series. We have one more presentation coming up next week, and the last presentation will be on how to be effective advocates. It'll be featuring Hanley Foundation board member John Macris and myself, so be sure to go online and register at hanleyfoundation.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation tonight, and we look forward to seeing you for our last session virtually next week. Have a great evening.